You're tuning into a special episode of Drive with NAR. Mike Takeover here in Boston, Massachusetts at NAR Next. I'm James Dwiggins, co-host of Real Estate Insider's Unfiltered podcast. You know me as Dwiggy Dwiggins, along with my partner in crime, Mr. Keith Robinson, crazy uncle.
Yes, sir.
Bryan Greene, Vice President of Policy Advocacy for NAR. This was a fun one because I'm a political junkie.
You are. You should really tell them what we talked about.
Well, you can do it. I'll add a little flavor to it.
Perfect. So talked about what he is concerned, or actually what was interesting, not concerned with for 2020.
Yeah, it was an interesting comment, actually.
Yeah. Talked about affordability a bit. We talked about first-time home buyers some. We talked about how they are approaching going into 2025 and the advocacy work that they're going to do.
How much work the team does that people don't realize that. And then the racial divide in ownership in this country too, which was a good conversation to have. And I hope everybody tunes into this one.
Yeah, this is an important one, and you need to put it in your ears, kids, on this one.
Bryan, welcome to the podcast. We are very excited to have you here. Lots of stuff to talk about since earlier this week, and there hasn't been any conversations on social media about it at all.
Not much.
So
Pretty
look,
slow year for you in general,
I haven't
right?
had time to look at this.
It's a dumpster fire. You're all right.
I believed you for a second.
Yeah. Look, we know you're busy, and we're excited to have this discussion with you. We talk a lot in the advocacy team about the stuff that you're working on leading up to elections and things. I would love to ask this question a little bit differently. So obviously the elections happened. Where do you go next? Like, what happens now the election's over? You had some candidates. I'm assuming that, you were supporting, some win, some lose, like I'm sure always. What's the next step? Where does the team focus on now in this forward basis?
Well, believe it or not, a good part of that answer is we keep doing what we're doing.
Okay.
So, insofar as analysts say that, that rent and housing costs contributed to Trump's victory, what's clear is that home prices are not going down.
Nope.
And I think what's key, or what was key for many politicians, was how effectively they leaned into it. One of the things I think we can take away from this last campaign and be proud of is that housing was on the agenda.
Yeah.
You had, in the presidential race, both candidates and their running mates talking about housing, including in the debates. I think it may have been the first question in the vice presidential debate.
Right.
Candidates across the country talking about it in their congressional races. So we know this is a major concern, should be a major concern. And I think NAR is going to continue to look at different ways to advocate. And, regardless of the composition of Congress, that's going to be our focus. How we tailor that message, what tactics we use, might change based on, let's say, where the House goes or whichever. But we've got lots of data and lots of ways to tack in order to persuade officials in power that we need to tackle this.
And tell us, just go a little deep on that for a second. What does that look like? Because I think people don't understand the amount of work that goes on behind the scenes. Certainly people that are here, at the convention are very involved, but there's 10,000 people here. There's, almost 1.5 million people elsewhere that are not. And so give them a little bit.
Well, if people don't see what happens behind the scenes, you have cameras here. People can see that I'm going gray. and
it's called real estate.
Right.
Keith's bald.
And very gray.
On the other,
you're doing fine. Don't worry.
We've been talking about these issues, with the administration, the current administration, with the various agencies, and on Capitol Hill. Obviously, we have an expansive lobbying team that's meeting with, members individually, senators. But I think the other thing in terms of, behind the scenes, which is critically important right now, is we do a great deal of research. And, what we're seeing in the research indicates that America, can run but can't hide from the housing affordability
problem.
Yeah. And just right now, for example, we just put out a study that shows that first-time home buyers, purchases by first-time home buyers this past year at a record low.
Record
Yep.
low.
Right.
Lowest ever, correct?
Lowest ever since
Yeah.
we've been keeping
Since-
data.
Yeah.
And then also, we're finding that the average age of first-time home buyers is the highest ever. So all-time high there.
Two bad combos.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. And
Right.
then, I don't want to depress everybody,
Yeah.
but all cash buyers in the market are at all-time high too.
Mhm.
So if you go back to the first-time home buyers, they're already competing with constrained supply. You hear people talking about institutional investors too, which in some markets is having great impact. But then on top of it, just regular existing homeowners who have equity in their properties who are looking to upgrade or whatever, show up, pay cash.
Right.
And so figuring out the secret sauce of how do we help these first-time home buyers
Mhm.
is going to be critical. And the particular measures we take may be different under Trump administration or Republican Senate or House than it would have been last week.
Right.
Let me
Right.
do a follow up on that too, because Keith knows I'm kind of a political junkie sometimes.
That's
Do
true.
you? Are we?
Emphasis on junkie.
Yeah.
Well, he gets to be the nerd for data all the time. I get
Yes.
to do the
He's-
political junkie
He's the
stuff.
political nerd. I'm the data
Okay,
nerd.
okay.
Yeah.
Are you
Economics.
concerned about both candidates have not done a good job of explaining how they're going to deal with the deficit and debt in this country, which we're now at $1 trillion of interest every year. They're going to have to be they're going to face this problem, and how they deal with it's going to be the big question.
Yeah.
Everyone's going to be dealing with cuts somewhere. What do we do? How do we make sure that real estate's a very significant part of our GDP?
Yeah.
Right.
How do we make sure that this is not the area where these
Yeah.
That's happened.
cuts happen?
Yeah.
Is swearing allowed?
Yeah,
All right. Well, I mean, reality.
maybe.
All right.
No swearing.
I'll take it back. Reality is a B.
Yeah.
And just to say that, reality is going to come crashing down,
Right.
right? And you mentioned interest rates. There are a lot of things we may want to do in terms of tax relief, but that could also hang the mortgage rates
Right.
high
Sure, right.
long term, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And the reality too is we have whole generation. I mean, I was talking about the age of first-time home buyers
Right.
who may not see that prospect and who are some of those folks facing retirement or at least delaying
Yeah.
what they can save for retirement because they don't have this major investment. 40 times homeowners have 40 times the wealth.
Yeah. It's
Yeah,
the
right.
single largest
Right.
wealth generator
Right.
for most
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
And I always think of the John Oliver saying that when he did a program on home ownership, he said, "Oh, and by the way, anyone under 35, this show is not for you because you will never effing own a home."
Right.
And so, but it's a joke, but it is borne out in the data.
Right.
And so we can't avoid that.
Right.
And if we want social stability in the country,
Mm.
we have to address it, and because it's also cutting racially.
Yeah.
And we know from our demographics that the majority of net new home buyers are people of color,
Mhm.
right? And existing homeowners, many of whom, for a variety of reasons, aren't prepared or incentivized to sell,
Right.
are holding on to properties which they very well may bequeath to their children,
Mhm.
Right.
and that further
It doesn't enter back into the
yeah,
inventory
yeah, it
pool.
further
Right.
exacerbates
Yeah.
the,
Yeah.
the inequality. So all of those things we have to tackle in one way or another. Reality is going to confront us.
I'm going to come back to that because I want to actually ask you what policies we should be looking at to address some of this stuff. But
Mhm.
I know Keith has a question he's been wanting to ask about sort of
I do.
concerns.
Yeah. So I have one other question first, because while I do agree that during this last election cycle, at least housing was mentioned, but no one really had
Yeah, there wasn't
a
really
plan,
a plan.
right? No, it was mentioned, but not deeply discussed.
I mean, there were some policies,
I
but it
would say
wasn't
there
a
were
lot.
some,
There
yeah,
was some, but
Yeah.
it wasn't really.
yeah,
I guess not enough, in my opinion. And this is just views,
Right.
expressive views of Keith
Yeah.
Robinson, right? But like, when does it become something that's mentioned to something that's actionable and there's a plan for it, like a real
that's a good
plan of
question.
significance?
yeah. Well, once you're in office, right? I mean, you can run on various platforms, and I think it's important to make bold statements
Mhm.
of your vision,
Sure.
but obviously, how that looks in legislation is likely to be different. Actually,
Right.
that's where the details are going to be hashed
Well,
out.
and it's going to be important depending upon whether President Trump has control, the Republican Party has control of the Senate and the House as well
Yeah.
to get those things passed, or
Right.
if you're going to have
Yeah.
infighting like normal. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, to some extent, concepts of a plan are helpful.
Yeah.
but
right.
but
Yeah.
it's likely that you're going to detail those plans later.
Mm.
Even better if your concept is a sound concept.
Right. That's helpful.
Yeah, and that people are voting for something that's going to actually help us all.
Right.
And so, but what's helpful is that that a lot of that work is already happening.
Mm.
Right. We at NAR have supported a number of bipartisan measures that are going to help in terms of inventory. And when I say inventory, I'm not talking about housing production necessarily, but that issue of circulation.
Give us an example of one of those.
So the More Homes on the Market Act,
Okay.
one of the reasons why a lot of people who have great equity in their homes, many who maybe over 40 years, I was hanging out with some friends in Boston who've actually seen their property values increase like 20 times in
Since they've
30
been-
years.
Yeah.
And but if you're going to sell that,
There's a tax event.
it's a tax event, and the amount of capital gains you can exclude
Right.
Mhm.
hasn't changed since 1997 or something like that, right?
Right.
And so,
But values certainly
and
have.
value certainly have,
Yeah.
and so with inflation, that absolute dollar figure would have doubled
Mhm.
if the capital gains exclusion had actually been set to increase with inflation. So by proposing to double that may encourage some of the existing homeowners to
Put more stuff on the
To get it
more
back
stuff.
into the
Right.
market.
Now that does not add to the overall number of units.
Right.
Number of units are not just going to suddenly materialize.
Mm.
So we have to have strategies there. The Neighborhood Homes Investment Act is helpful, especially in distressed areas, that it can produce some units and actually rehabilitate some units that are going obsolescent. But then you also have some of these measures like the Downtown and Main Streets Act, which is supposed to provide tax incentives to convert commercial to residential property. But honestly, we need to do all those things, but it's not enough.
Right. All that and more.
We
Yeah.
have a 5.5 million unit shortage,
Mm.
which accumulated over 15 to 20 years. So we really need some bold action. I describe it as a Marshall Plan
Mm.
to build in this country. And we had a forum here yesterday where we focused on some of that. And folks said, we need to be thinking about how do we build mass scale?
Right.
What do we do in terms of like modular and others? And how do we make sure we don't undermine ourselves? The whole tariff discussion is like,
Yeah, it's a big thing,
that can
right?
have
We
an
don't.
impact on materials.
You know what I just
Yeah.
from everything you just covered is I had this sort of epiphany that there are so many people who do not understand or appreciate how much work is going on that is happening to make sure that all of this functions in this country.
Yeah.
All of those things, I wasn't aware of some of those as well, and I wish
Right.
I was.
Right.
And we have to continue to work on getting that information out, because without that arm, this advocacy team doing that, this whole thing
I'll be
goes
here, I'll be-
very
Yeah.
different. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I want to keep this moving just because of
Yeah.
time. So
Yeah,
we got two more questions
Yeah.
for you.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what's happening on Capitol Hill 2025.
Mhm.
What are you concerned about coming out of Capitol Hill for 2025?
Well, I wouldn't call it a concern, but what I know we will.
That's
be,
good news. I'll
Yeah,
take that.
yeah. Well, I mean, in the housing,
Yeah, you're housing. Fair.
what I'll say is that what we are concerned with, that what we want to make sure we do, is see that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions that are set to expire are extended, the ones that will be beneficial to
Sure.
homeowners and to the real estate industry. So I think that's key.
Mhm.
And, I was on this advocacy scoop we had here the other day, and my director of federal taxation policy was talking about this too. The composition of the House can sort of cut both ways. That, there are many pro-business benefits if there's a Republican House. But then many Democrats have strongly supported measures that would boost supply that we
Right.
desperately need.
Mhm.
And so there's the possibility, if there's a Democratic House, for some compromise around some measures that would do a bit of both. But supply is absolutely essential. And so I guess if you ask what I'm concerned about, I'm concerned that we don't have enough Republicans leading on the supply. But I think there's great potential. And as I said, reality is confronting us. And fortunately, we have very good relationships with the folks who may be the chairs of the relevant committees for us.
The influence, you mentioned that a little bit earlier in the show. We'll wrap up with this because this is something that it's an incredible problem. So the racial homeownership gap is larger than ever in this country. What do we do? What would you suggest we should be doing to reverse this trend?
Well, there are certain things that we must do to try to keep it from getting worse. So housing supply, for example, because the lack of housing supply is creating the affordability challenge in the country. Right. And those who have more, as I've said, are the ones who are most likely to benefit. And it's actually going to be those who have more are going to have even greater advantages, and those who have less are going to have even greater disadvantages. And that cuts racially in this country because of our history of excluding people from home ownership for decades and centuries. And so, I think we're going to have to confront the fact that if we aren't willing to do anything reparative in this country, we may not see those measures, those gaps close. Under the Biden administration, there were some efforts to do certain things like special purpose credit programs and others, and to try to tailor them in such a way that they address some of the past discrimination. I don't think that's something the Trump administration is likely to do, but I think, again, data is going to show that if we don't do something along those lines, we may see them exacerbate, and it can lead to some significant problems in this country, especially if the majority of the net new homeowners are people of color. So we're gonna have to figure out certain ways to do it. We just passed a shared equity model policy that we want to support those kinds of programs that are through shared equity going to help people with down payment assistance and closing costs. We know some states are doing things to redress past discrimination, and many of those states, like Washington State, realtors supported those measures. So some other states are looking at those things. So some of the states may do some things in this area, but we have to confront it and be honest about it.
Yeah.
Bryan, I just wanted to, as we close out, just thank you for all the work that you do. You, Shannon, the whole team. We do appreciate it. And sometimes it doesn't feel like you get the appreciation from the membership as you deserve.
I'll give you my Venmo and you can shop.
Okay, I'll take you up. I'll buy you a cocktail. But just genuinely, thanks for everything. We appreciate you stopping by, and keep up the amazing work that you're doing.
Thanks for having
the
me.
work.
Awesome.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you for joining us at the NAR Next Conference in Boston, Massachusetts. We have been doing the Drive with NAR podcast in association with Real Estate Insiders Unfiltered. We want to thank everybody for tuning in. We appreciate all of that. Make sure you subscribe to both podcasts. We got a lot of content coming.